Hello and welcome back to another update as I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It's your host Weep Union, and in this one we start out in the Robotyne direction, where the Russians have managed to advance within the village itself, advancing a small bit along the westernmost road upwards in the direction of the Ukrainian fortifications in the northern outskirts of the village. With this geolocated footage, we confirm that the Russians have indeed advanced this section here, with the use of an infantry fighting vehicle, where it was shot multiple times by both cluster munitions and other explosive devices before it dropped off its infantry grouping that then took up a position in the area, and the infantry fighting vehicle headed for a retreat. It seems that the Ukrainians, in their lack of artillery shells, are using cluster munitions, which they likely have a surplus of, as that is one of the most recent donations in form of artillery shells for the Ukrainians against these vehicles, but they are not very effective, as most of the vehicles survive based on the videos we see from this sort of footage. Further northeast, in the northwestern direction of Verbove, the Russians have restarted their offensive operation towards the Ukrainian fortifications overlooking the Zaporizhzhia front, as the Russians, if they manage to gain control over these fortifications, would be able to push over and cut off the Ukrainian positions south of these positions, which would allow them to gain control over a large section of the front line with little to no fighting. Moving on to the next section of the front line, we see here in the direction of Krasnohorivka that the Russians managed to gain a bit further control over the central parts of the city before actually launching an offensive operation towards the factory area, the industrial area in the central parts of the city. This is all confirmed in this video here. In this video, there's a reappearance of the Russian hero, the turtle tank, or as I like to call it, the Seath Cage, with this tank that is covered with the parachute area, the massive metal framework above the tank. And despite the shelling and FPV drones hitting the tank, it has survived this assault and previous assaults into the city. This new assault reaches the industrial area of the city. It just drives back and forth by the railways in and out of the city, and then moves further in after retreating out. It just goes back into the city, into the central parts of the city. It is under shelling and it doesn't get destroyed. It seems that this new framework of the tank is very effective at increasing the survivability of it. We do see a lack of ATGM missiles against this tank. This likely indicates that the Ukrainians in this section of the front line, at the very least, are lacking in that area, but we do see that the tank, despite its limited visibility, is able to move through, and considering that it is able to move into the central parts of the city and then just leave again, shows that the Ukrainian lack of ammunition is very severe, considering that cluster munitions was sent against the tank, and yet again, cluster munitions isn't really effective against armored vehicles, as we see with this footage as well. Two vehicles just drove past it with no issues. Cluster munitions is purely for the infantry units. But we see the tank moved all the way to the industrial zone, and then it just turns around and moves back. But following this video, we have these two pieces of geolocated footage, one of them confirming the advance in the central parts, and the second one advancing all the way through to the industrial zone. This raises multiple questions. The first one is, did the Russians actually gain positions here, or did the turtle tank simply just drive in as a tourist, touring around before retreating and turning back to the rear? And the second question is exactly which routes did they take? Did they move through by the railways and enter through the southern parts, or did they move through the fortifications? Because that could indicate a Russian control over the fortifications in the central parts of the city, which would be a major disaster for the Ukrainian defense within the city. It is clear that the Russian bombing with FAB bombs and the Air Force is very effective and has allowed the Russians to advance through these fortifications and gain a central foothold within Krasnohorivka. At the same time, there's also clear evidence of the lack of ammunition for the Ukrainians. And since the FPV drones are not really effective against the turtle tank, it is pretty much invincible in this section of the front line, driving wherever it wants to. It does not overextend, it simply scouts ahead and clears positions for the infantry to take up positions following the advances of the tank. It is likely based on this performance that the Russians will create more of these tanks, even though it reduces the visibility and the maneuverability of the turret. It is much easier for them to use something that has decreased mobility, but is pretty much impenetrable than to have better tanks that has better visibility, but in the end, it's blown up by an FPV drone. Moving on to the next section of the front line, we have yet another breakthrough by the Russians. This is to the south of Pervomaiske. Following the capture of the city, the Russians have advanced further westwards towards Nitailove, capturing the fortifications outside of the village, and according to reports, the first units have entered the village as well. This marks the start of the Battle of Nitailove. At the same time, the Russians made a significant advance in the southern direction, capturing the fortifications here in the central parts, which has completely cut off the Ukrainian fortifications to the south of Pervomaiske, encircling the Ukrainian positions there, as the only road in and out is now directly above Nevelske, which is also under Russian control, and the near proximity of it allows direct fire control of the road, and it is likely that the Russians will move in to physically cut it off. This means that the Ukrainian positions in the fortifications to the east of these positions are completely cut off, and it is likely that the Russians will capture this area completely within the next few days, which will lead to the front line moving significantly further westwards and securing the southern flank of Pervomaiske, which will allow the Russians to focus completely on Nitailove. Getting control of that as well would indicate that the Russians would have a secure southern flank in the west of Avdiivka, after which the Russians will focus on Yasnobrodivka, here to the west of Tonenke, and Umanske to the north. Moving further north, we see here in the direction of Berdishi, the Ukrainians are launching counterattacks. They have managed to regain positions here in the northern parts of Berdishi, pushing the Russians away from the fortifications the Ukrainians have available in the area. And at the same time, they're launching counterattacks towards the western parts of Berdishi, which so far is in the gray zone due to the Ukrainian counterattacks, allowing them to push out some Russians within the area. It is also unclear how many Russian soldiers even was in the western parts, as the only evidence we had of Russian soldiers being present there was of a video of Ukrainian MLRS strike on those positions, meaning that it could even be in the gray zone in the first place. But with this, we see that the Ukrainians are launching counterattacks to the northern parts of Berdishi, trying to break the siege of Semenivka, where the Russians have managed to gain control of the majority of the village, leaving only a small section under Ukrainian control. And it is likely that the Ukrainians were pushed back, meaning that there are significant amounts of Ukrainian soldiers by Semenivka, which the Ukrainians are likely looking to allow to retreat through the northern road by pushing the Russians back. It is unlikely that the Ukrainians are launching this counterattack to regain control over Berdishi, because they simply are that far behind, pushed back, especially with the recent Russian advances north of the area southeast of Ocheretine, allowing the Russians to now gain positions very close to Ocheretine, according to the latest reports, only 500 meters away, marking the beginning of the Battle of Ocheretine as well. This means that the Ukrainian third line of defense is now under attack by the Russians. This is the third line west of Avdiivka. We see across the front that the Russians are significantly pushing through the Ukrainian defenses. Russians going through to the central parts of Krasnovorivka was unthinkable just weeks ago, considering that it took the Russians weeks just to get a foothold. The fact that they are able to reach the central parts in the industrial area by just driving through like they're touring as a tourist destination. Krasnovorivka, a major fortified city near the front line, which has stayed untouched for over 2 years. Suddenly the Russians reach the central parts within a few days. That is completely unthinkable, and I believe that is a clear evidence of the Ukrainian lines completely crumbling and collapsing. Not to mention the Russian significant advance south of Pervomaiske. They simply pushed through the Ukrainian fortifications and cut off who knows how many Ukrainian soldiers within this pocket. Combining that with the recent advances across the front, the most heavily fortified areas across the front are being pushed through by the Russian soldiers, capturing square kilometers day by day as they push through the Ukrainian fortifications and reach the front line. I believe at this point the only reason the Russians aren't advancing more is simply because they aren't pushing more than they are actually gaining. They want to stay safe, consolidate the positions before they advance further. But I believe as soon as a Russian offensive begins, the clear signs that we have been seeing of the Ukrainian army's deterioration will significantly speed up, and the Ukrainian lines may completely collapse in a large scale. And that will be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.